In my 20s, I wrote a book called The End of Nature. When I wrote that book, I realized that I desperately did not want the world to heat up and wither and blow away. I liked the world sort of the way it was, with a little bit of ice at the top and bottom and the odd coral reef in between. And so it became my life's work to slow down those shifts some. The idea that I grew up with, that there was this thing called nature that was bigger than people and outside our control, that's what we've lost. If we had gone to work as a world wholeheartedly in 1989, we wouldn't have solved this problem yet, but we'd be well on the way. For 700,000 years, humans have been enthusiastic burners of things. We learned to cook food, and that gave us the big brain. We were able to move north and south from the equator. No one was going to live in Vermont before you invented fire, you know. When we learned to control the combustion of coal and oil and gas in the Industrial Revolution, that produced modernity. The problem is now, drawbacks to combustion have become enormous. We now know from great investigative reporting that the oil industry, right at the moment that I was writing that first book, was busy doing their own investigations of climate change. Exxon scientists told their executives in the 1980s how hot it was going to get and how fast. Exxon's executives started building their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they hired the people who used to work for the tobacco industry to build this huge edifice of denial.
It's light of time.
Now, when we've reached the point where it's really impossible to pretend the planet isn't getting warmer, now they engage in slightly more sophisticated forms of greenwashing and denial. If you've been watching Exxon's ads for the last decade, you might conclude that Exxon was an algae company that happened to have a few oil wells on the side someplace.
Algae-derived fuel could help us meet growing demand while reducing emissions.
We're making a big commitment to finding out just how much algae can help to meet the fuel demands of the world.
As it turns out, they put some tiny, minuscule percentage of their research budget into things like algae and just kept looking for more oil and gas. If you're Exxon, you've prospered for 100 years by having people write you a check every month or every week or whatever it is for another shipment of energy. To them, the idea that you could pay to put a solar panel on your roof and then after that, the energy would be delivered for free every morning when the sun rises above the horizon, they hate it. And that's why they've been willing to go to the mat to try and make sure it doesn't happen. About 70% of Americans understand that climate change is real and it's a problem that we have to do something about. And in America as divided as ours, 70%'s not too bad. The problem is activating as much of that 70% as possible to actually make it an issue that our political leaders can no longer avoid. Everybody likes solar power. When we poll it, it comes up with huge approval ratings from Republicans, Independents, Democrats. If you're a conservative, like my home is my castle and now with solar power on the roof, I don't have to connect to anybody. Liberals are like, oh, the groovy power of the sun is networking us all into this big grid. The sun and the sky really are great uniters. As we move towards renewable energy, it's going to do great things for our economy. Oxford University did a big study a couple years ago, and they found that a rapid switch to renewables would save the planet tens of trillions of dollars. They didn't even measure the damage that's averted by not having all-out climate change. They were just talking about the fact that you no longer have to write a check every month for some coal or some gas or some oil. That instead you'd be getting that power from the sun, which for some reason has decided not to charge for it. One of the problems with relying on fossil fuel is that it means that the people who control those few small deposits of coal and gas and oil end up with too much power, which they tend to abuse. The Koch brothers are our biggest oil and gas barons, and they used their winnings to degrade our democracy. Vladimir Putin used his to invade Ukraine. One of the nice things about the sun and the wind is nobody owns them, and they exist everywhere, which means that moving in their direction moves us at least somewhat in the direction of local control of one of the most important things in our world. Climate change is unique among our political problems in that it comes with these really tough time limits. We're kind of used to problems that exist forever and we make incremental progress on them. As long as I've been alive, America's been debating whether or not to have national health care like every other industrialized country. I imagine someday that we'll eventually do it, and I hope it's soon because people die and go bankrupt every year when we don't. But the fact that we've delayed doesn't make it harder to solve the problem when we eventually get there. Climate change isn't like that. Climate change is this series of ratchets that work one way. Once you've melted the Arctic, no one has a plan for how you freeze it back up again. No one can set a kind of exact drop-dead date for planet Earth, when climate change will just overwhelm us. We've already raised the temperature of the Earth pretty near 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is causing extraordinary problems. The North and South poles are melting. The hydrological cycle, the way that water moves around the planet, is completely disrupted. So we have way more flood and way more drought. That's going to get worse at 2 degrees Celsius and worse again at 3 degrees. Compromise is a very useful thing in a democratic society. That's how most of our problems are solved. You think that there should be no minimum wage because you're a libertarian. I think the minimum wage should be $30 an hour because that's what it takes to live. We meet in the middle at $15 and we come back in a few years to argue it out again. That's not how climate change works. The negotiation that's going on here isn't between Democrats and Republicans or environmentalists and industrialists. The deepest negotiation is between human beings and physics. And physics is a very poor negotiator. It's just going to do what it's going to do, so our job is to meet the bar that it sets. Young people are providing most of the leadership in the climate fight, and thank God. There's millions of them engaged in this. We know about Greta Thunberg, and we should. She's remarkable.
Standing on the brink of a catastrophe.
What fun it was to send her a letter of congratulations this year on her graduation from high school. Think about that a minute. But you know what? I heard too many people my age say, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve this. That's a rotten thing to say, and it's also an impractical one. Young people, for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, lack the structural power to make the change we need on the scale that we required in the time that we have. If you have hair coming out your ears, then you're likely to have structural power coming out of your ears too. Those of us over 60, there's 70 million of us in this country. We all vote, and we ended up with most of the money too. We got about 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you wanted to take on Washington or Wall Street, it's good to have some people with hairlines like mine backing up those young people. Those of us in our 60s and 70s and 80s now, in our first act, we were around for the greatest moment of social and cultural and political transformation ever. Maybe in our second act, we were a little more interested in consumerism than in citizenship, but that's water under the bridge. Now in our third act, we have time, resources, skills, and a sense of legacy, of the world we're leaving behind. Legacy seems like an abstract word until you reach a certain age. And then you understand that legacy means the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. My name is Bill McKibben, and this has been my brief but spectacular take on what we can do together.